Football and music, it's a relationship that is always evolving. In this video, we're going to look at the different stages between the two and how they have both influenced each other. It feels like they've always been put together. Even during the World War, soldiers would sing chants very similar to what football fans would sing at a stadium, maybe prominently like the Hitler has only got one ball song that you get taught about in history books that the soldiers sung during World War II. They very clearly sound like a chant that rival fans would sing to each other nowadays, and eventually these chants would turn into anthems, such as the famous You'll Never Walk Alone song, which is notably known with Liverpool, Celtic and Borussia Dortmund, but apparently was first sung by the Manchester United fans after the Munich air disaster, and they were trying to raise the spirit of the community and the club. So let's take a look at the three stages where I think music and football have merged with each other. Part 1, the unsuspected rockstar fan. The 70s just seemed like a great time to be into rock and roll music, especially in England. You had the Rolling Stones, the Who, Queen. However, I don't think football, like looking back at it, I don't think it seemed as tied to music as it is nowadays, because someone like a Led Zeppelin, one of the biggest rock groups of all time, huge in America but also huge in England, and Robert Plant, the lead singer of Led Zeppelin, is known for his incredible vocals, his incredible kind of like war cry singing that he does. But not many people know that, one, he is from Wolverhampton, he's not from a nice part of London, which they all seem to be, and two, he's a massive fan of Wolverhampton Wanderers. He used to go to the Molineux as a kid, and he's even said in interviews that he thinks he might have developed some of his singing talents from singing on the terraces at Molineux. It's even someone like Ozzy Osbourne apparently is a lifelong Aston Villa fan because he was brought up in Aston near the home stadium. But not many people know that, and I know people know he is from Birmingham, and I think part of that was, despite football, it's always going to be popular. It's the most popular sport probably in the history of mankind, but it wasn't as popular and it wasn't seen as probably as a high regard back then. It was definitely seen as a more working class sport, and the 70s was about drugs and fashion and music. And it's funny because even during that time of the 70s, where I personally think music developed the most it ever has done compared to the previous decade, you know, with the Beatles and the previous before that with Elvis and so on, Back Home was recorded by the England squad just before the 1970 World Cup. They obviously were the reigning champs from the 1966 World Cup, and it was one of the first times a football team had recorded a song, and it actually went to the top of the charts. However, you look at the song, they're all in suits, and they all speak very proper, and they sing very proper in it. It's as far away to Paranoid by Black Sabbath or Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin as you can get, and the two didn't really seem to overlap really, because you had these men like Bobby Charlton, Jeff Hurst, Bobby Moore, and then you had these people like Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, Pete Townsend, Freddie Mercury, who just seemed so eccentric, and the two just didn't really mix. But I think looking back, one of the biggest bands who started to bridge that gap between music and football, between the pop culture divide, was probably the Jam. The Jam were one of the biggest bands that England have probably ever seen, especially culturally wise, and Paul Weller is probably one of the still most cultural relevant icons in English music. I mean, he's never been as big as the Beatles or, like I say, the Rolling Stones, but culturally wise, there's so many people who have the same haircut still as Paul Weller did. There's so many people that talk the same as Paul Weller did. There's so many people who probably joined bands because Paul Weller started the Jam. And of course I wasn't born, but he was very instrumental in mod culture. From what I believe, he is a Chelsea fan, and despite Paul Weller, in my opinion, still being quite an eccentric person, yes, he kind of still has that lad look, but I mean, as musicians go, he's one of the most creative out there. It did seem to start the trend of fashion, music and football coming together to basically promote each other and, you know, pushing the brand out further. Part 2, the Britpop hooligans. We're moving on to the late 80s and 90s now, and I think we have to move to the northwest, especially in Manchester, because this is where everything seemed to start happening before the Britpop movement. We're going to talk about the Stone Roses and New Order before the Britpop, and I know they weren't that, but with New Order to start with, they were coming off a really traumatic breakup from Joy Division after Ian Curtis unfortunately killed himself, and they created New Order off the back of that. And in the late 80s, they created World in Motion, which was a huge hit around England, and it most notably has the rap from John Barnes, songs, which is still so culturally relevant. I mean, you'd have heard it across the pubs during the Euros for England. And the way this came about, apparently the FA press officer, David Bloomfield, was a huge fan of New Order and got in touch with Tony Wilson, who at the time was the head of Factory Records, who New Order, that was their label. Apparently they had multiple England players audition for the rap, including Peter Beardsley of all people, but John Barnes was given it just because he was by far the best. And like I say, the song went huge and topped the charts, and it's still one of the most iconic football songs today. But with this, it was slowly becoming into the public's eye that these musicians who were at the top of the charts were dressing like the people who were going to the game. And then I'm sure a lot of people older than me will remember this, but Manchester came in the 80s where it was the Happy Mondays, Stone Roses a bit, and I think this is where it really kicked it off, because these were just real lads who supported their local football teams. Stone Roses and Happy Mondays, I believe they all supported Man United, and you can even see that nowadays with even the recent, I believe it was last year, the Stone Roses did a campaign with Man United. This is the one of the Stone Roses top songs gets played before every game at Manchester United at Old Trafford, and you could argue still today they are the most important band within football. They are the most culturally important band within football. I Want to Be Adored, She Bangs the Drums, Waterfall, they're all integral parts of football casuals nowadays. I mean, if you watch the film Green Street or Football Factory, you'll hear so many of the Stone Roses songs play throughout. But there's another band who could argue they're the most culturally relevant within football, and that's Oasis. Liam Gallagher and I believe some of his mates went to a Stone Roses gig, and that inspired him to create the band Oasis with his mates. They're actually called The Rain before they turned into Oasis, but we all know the story of that. It became one of the biggest bands England has ever seen, and at the heart of this, it was the fact that they were Man City fans. Even in the early days of the promos, when Man City had the old brother t-shirt with the sponsor on it, the two brothers, Noel and Liam, were pictured wearing that. And I do really believe this is the start of when bands wanted to portray that they were regular lads who went to the football, because this seems where lad culture properly became prominent in the 90s. Main Road in 1996 is one of the most iconic outfits any frontman has ever worn, I think, when he wore the Umbro tracksuit that he stole from the Man City dressing room. And I really think this did help the band at the time, because Man United were dominating the newly brought in Premier League. So you think about it, the Premier League was all brand new, all the marketing was out there, it was getting pumped into all the TVs, Sky Sports was prominent, and Oasis were Man City fans who just opposed everything to do with Manchester United. So other than all the glory supporters down in Surrey at the time, everyone else hated United because they were just dominating the league. So the biggest band in the world, or at least in England at the time, were supporting the direct rivals of United. It was only just going to grow their popularity, and also probably the clubs at the time. However, it wasn't just the Gallaghers and the rest of the band who supported Man City and I believe a bit Man United. You had Pulp, I believe Jarvis Cocker is a Sheffield Wednesday fan. You had Blur, I believe Damon Albarn is a Chelsea fan. So all these British bands at the time had football teams that were tied to their identity. But I do believe this caused a bit of a ripple effect maybe in the 2000s, because it turned into then every indie band needed to have a football team tied. I remember watching Soccer AM when I was a kid, and you'd see this unknown indie band who, they sounded quite posh, they seemed out of touch, but they loved Rotherham, or they loved Barnsley, or they were a big fan of Reading, even though they probably had nothing to do with them. But I imagine a marketing team or the A&R manager told them, choose a band because you'll see more respectable and more down to earth to the average Joe. But to finish on this, I think Oasis probably did start the trend of playing in their hometown stadium, because they played in Main Road, like I said, in 1996, which apparently was a complete unknown thing at the time. Main Road was a football stadium, it wasn't an arena like they have nowadays, and this has taken it into the modern day, because the Kaiser Chiefs from Leeds played Ellen Road. Sam Fender, who's a huge Newcastle United fan, played St James's last year, and now it seems like it's a rite of passage for a band to play their favourite stadium. Even the Arctic Monkeys, who I believe are Sheffield Wednesday fans, it's not that well documented, but they did Hillsborough last year on their tour. Part 3, the grime and drill evolution. But in the 2010s, in my opinion, it was a huge shift from what was relevant basically. 2000 and especially the 90s were indie bands. Indie bands were at the top of the charts all the time. But in the 2010s, it shifted to, first of all, American rap, and then in the mid-2010s and definitely late 2010s, it shifted to grime. And this is where I think people became the least subtle in their lyrics, because, you know, you have people like Stormzy, you have people like Skepta, JME, all of these huge artists in England at the time, and I think Stormzy's a huge Man United fan. You have Dave, who is also a Man United fan, but they were involving footballers in their lyrics. Dave and AJ Tracy have a huge song called Thiago Silva, which, you guessed it, is about centre-back Thiago Silva. And I think this became the new craze because grime started to become the working class music for the working class people. Indie once was, but then it's definitely been gentrified over the time, and it's become probably more of the middle, even upper class music, whereas grime definitely is the working class music of the people at the moment. So when a lot of the footballers who probably come from similar backgrounds to a lot of these grime artists hear their names in lyrics, I'm sure it gets a bit of chemistry between them, because I listened to an interview with Shaquille O'Neal in the NBA, and he said when he heard Biggie Smalls in the 90s, a song called Gimme the Loot, he mentioned Shaquille O'Neal's name, and it instantly got a connection between the two, and I think it was a mutual respect, which I'm sure they see nowadays. It's constant, and I think it has probably become a bit of a meme nowadays, because I think it's probably a bit overused, but still, it's definitely put a bridge between the two. Any genre of music that is the most relevant with football is definitely grime. You see AJ Tracy opening up at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. You see him even on kit launches for the club. And back in the 90s and 2000s, there was no chance that Manchester United would put a rapper on their kit launch. But nowadays, you'll see, I believe Stormzy did the advert for Paul Pogba signing for the club again. And the clubs know it because the clubs know how popular these artists are and how they can market to them to the younger audience. I do think my best thing is seeing Jose Mourinho in that Stormzy music video. That is one of the most iconic things I've probably ever seen. But there's always going to be a relationship between the two. I think I heard it probably in America about the NBA, but someone said athletes always want to be entertainers, and entertainers always want to be athletes. Most of us wanted to grow up being either a footballer or in a band. Maybe not a rapper in my sense, but I know other people would. And I think that is why the two love each other so much. Oasis, I do think, are maybe the most important people in football culture tying it to music, because they set the scene where it was tied to their identity. And I think they even talked about how Joe Cole would always pester them when he was a kid in West Ham, and I think he really wanted to be involved with the band. And I think you see that nowadays, because a lot of these rappers and footballers are mates with each other. But we'll see. I think it's dying down slightly nowadays in terms of the grime music, and you never know, maybe the indie music might come back, maybe rock music might come back, and that might be the most culturally relevant with football. But we'll see. But if you like this video, if you could leave a like, and if you could leave a comment, that'd be great. Tell me I'm not educated on all of this. I wasn't alive in the 70s and 80s, as people have told me in previous videos. But yeah, tell me what you know about it. And if you could subscribe to the channel, that'd be great. But thanks for watching.